equator emerald. This is Indonesia. Multicultural country. Abundant in natural resources. This is a blessing. Natural heritage that must be managed wisely. Producing an abundance of sustainable natural wealth. Present and future for us. This rich nature is for us. A bountiful blessing. From Indonesia. This fertile land should be managed in a wise and sustainable manner. We guarantee the feasibility of farming based on expertise and experience. Since 1905, supported by natural resources that are always honed by knowledge, innovation, and technology. So, providing a certainty about the feasibility of managing land in a sustainable manner.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace be on you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Best wishes for all of us, and good afternoon, good evening to all participants from the outside of Indonesia. Let me begin by giving you a warm welcome to the second day, the first International Conference on Sustainable Tropical Land Management, the 17th September 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed the program today, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Honorable Dr. Haris Syahbuddin, Executive Secretary, Indonesian Agency for Agricultural Research and Development, our invited speaker today, our invited and all participants. Ladies and gentlemen, now we come to our third plenary session. Before we start, let me inform you, we will have also a parallel session in the end of the plenary. Let's start the plenary session 3, and we have Dr. Patricio Gresini from University of Nebraska, Lincoln, USA, Professor Fahmuddin Agus, Indonesian Soil Research Institute, Professor Meine van Noordwijk from World Agroforestry Center, Nairobi, Kenya, and Dr. Haris Syahbudin, the Executive Secretary, Indonesian Agency for Agricultural Research and Development. We will have this session from now and we'll line up at 10:15. Dr. Haris Syahbudin, the time's yours.
Okay, thank you, Bu Grace. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everybody. Distinguished keynote speaker today, and all the participants. Welcome to the International Conference on Sustainable Tropical Land Management in the second day and in the third plenary session today. And this third plenary session, we have three keynote speakers. First is Dr. Patricio Grassini from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, US. The second speaker is Professor Fahmuddin Agus, Indonesian Soil Research Institute, ICHAL, ARD. And the third one is Professor Meine van Noordwijk from World Agroforestry Center, Nairobi, Kenya. And the title of the presentation from Patricio Grassini is he will talk about the potential cereal production increase in Indonesia with current land and water resources. Before we start for the first keynote speaker, allow me to deliver his curriculum vitae from Patricio Grassini. Dr. Patricio Grassini is an associate professor of agronomy at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Patricio earned bachelor's student in agriculture engineering from University of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and for PhD in agronomy from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He has authored more than 70 papers published in the peer-reviewed journal, including top-tier journals such as Natural Communication, Nature Sustainability, PNES, and Plant, Cell, and Environment. And also, he wrote 10 book chapters. His research interests center on yield potential, yield gap analysis, and resources and energy use efficiency. Patricio applied research cover a diverse range of crop system, including rain-fed crop in South America, irrigated crop in the US, cornbread and Asia. And also he has some research about the oil palm in Indonesia. A major ongoing project is in the Global Yield Gap Atlas. All the participants can access in the website www.yieldgap.org. You can look at his ongoing major project, which provide estimate of gap between actual and potential yield from major cropping system. Dr. Gracia also was a recipient of the Fulbright Scholarship and other 3 fellowship and 6 awards, including the Agronomy Society of America, Early Career Award, and W.L. Nelson Award for diagnosing yield limiting factor. Patricia also served as a member of the editorial advisor board of Field Crop Research and Global Food Security Journal. Patricia was the chair of the Crop Science Society of American Crop Ecology Division during 2019. Okay, let's restart for the presentation. We have 2 hours and 10 minutes, and each keynote speaker have 30 minutes for the presentation, and after that we have the question and answer about the 50 minutes. Okay, let we start for the first speaker. Time is yours, Pak Patricia. Thank you very much.
Selamat pagi. Thank you very much, Ibu Gries and Pak Haris for the introduction. It is my pleasure to be here with you. I wish we can see each other physically in Bali, but unfortunately the context doesn't allow that. But I want to really thank all the organizers for inviting me for this conference. And I'm going to share now my screen, if it is okay for you.
Okay.
So, Haris, if you allow me to share my screen, I will show my slides.
Yeah, you can share your screen. Please, Pak Saiful, you can have the...
They need to allow me to share my screen.
Yeah, yeah.
You can share your file, please.
Okay.
Yeah, Patricia, you can share your...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And before we start, why don't we make sure that people can hear me? So, because I just saw a message in the chat of someone saying that he could not hear me well. So maybe you may want to check on that as we move on. But in the meantime, I will continue. Okay?
Okay.
Fine. All right. So before I start, I want to make sure that everybody understands that despite I am the presenter here, this is really a teamwork, a team effort, and includes many of my colleagues in Indonesia, including Professor Famulin Agus, as well as many other dear colleagues from BPTP, from BPPADI, from the Indonesian from the Indonesian Cereal Research Institute, as well as Indonesian Soil Research Institute. And again, I really want to thank the organizers for thinking about me and for presenting at this conference. Today, or better to say tonight for me, because here in Nebraska is 8 p.m.
8 p.m. Okay.
I'm going to present about a prognosis about the potential cereal production increase in Indonesia with current land and water resources. Pak Haris, everything is okay?
People yeah, it's okay. It's good. Okay, good.
Okay, great. Then I will move on. And by the way, as you can imagine, I'm quite tired after working the whole day. So please bear with me if you don't understand something or I make mistakes, and I apologize in advance in advance for that.
Yeah.
Okay, let me give you first a little bit of context about rice and maize production in Indonesia. The country is the third and the 8th largest paddy and jagung producing country in the world. It has imported rice and maize in the past, but the amount has been lower, or even there has been no imports in more recent years.
Mm-hmm.
But the demand for rice and maize in the future is expected to keep increasing as a result of population growth, and especially due to the higher calorie intake per capita. And there is a very ambitious mandate made by the government to ensure self-sufficiency for rice and for maize. So the question is to which extent Indonesia can meet this extra maize and rice demand that will occur in the future. And there are basically two ways to produce more paddy and more jagung. One is by increasing the area planted with those two crops. Mm-hmm. We call that as cropland expansion. Another way to increase production is by increasing the yield, the rata-rata productivitas on the existing cropland area. And we refer to that process as intensification. So one can imagine different combinations of cropland expansion and intensification that could lead to the same production target. So one one can eventually produce 1 million tons of grain with a large tract of land but with lower yields, with an intermediate land expansion and yield level, or with a high yield level that will require less land. There are many reasons why we believe that it's better to go on this direction instead of this one. We believe that it makes more sense to intensify production on existing cropland area rather than on expanding area into new regions. And then let me give you some examples. One of the reasons is that most of the best agricultural land that is suitable for long-term crop production has already been brought into production, and what remains is not necessarily the best. And this is an example of farmers in West Nusa Tenggara growing upland rice on steep land after this land was clear. And you can see there are all kinds of problems, including severe erosion. And at the same time, we are also expanding into other environments that are more fragile, like, and this is another example for tidal single rice in South Kalimantan. And while we are expanding into these environments, we are at the same time losing some of our best farmland located, for example, as in this example, near Jakarta or in Karawang, where some of the best area for growing paddy sawah is being converted for residential and industrial purposes. So as you can see, on the one hand, we are losing our best area for agriculture, and we are trying to compensate for that by expanding into new areas that are not necessarily the best. And that's kind of illustrated here in this table, where I'm showing what is the land requirement to replace 1 hectare of irrigated rice land that is being lost in Java. In other words, if we lost 1 hectare of paddy area in Java, how much area in other environments it takes to compensate for that? Well, currently the rata productivitas of paddy in Java is around 6 tons per hectare, and farmers can usually grow about 2 crops per year. Now, if we lose 1 hectare of irrigated rice and we are planning to compensate for that by expanding, for example, lowland rainfall rice in other environments, that will take proportionally more area, because lowland rainfall rice has lower productivity, and usually farmers do not grow as many cycles as it is the case of irrigated rice. They may grow 1 up to 2.
Yeah.
So you can see here that in order to, the land that is required to compensate for the loss of 1 hectare of rice land in Java is about is equivalent to 1.6 hectares of lowland rainfall rice. That will give us the same productivity that you can achieve with 1 hectare of irrigated rice in Java. Now, this land substitution cost will get even higher as you try to expand into more low yield environments, as it is the case of tidal or swampy rice or upland rice. So for example, in the case of upland rice, the productivity is about half of the average yield of irrigated rice, and farmers can only grow 1 crop per cycle. So to compensate for the loss of productivity of losing 1 hectare of irrigated rice in Java, you will need 3 to 4 times more land planted with upland rice somewhere else. So as you can see, there are many good reasons why it's important, on the one hand, to try to increase our productivity on the existing cropland area, and on the other hand, to try to preserve and maintain our current area and don't let it get lost due to urbanization for residential and industrial purposes. Because again, the substitution cost is very high if we are planning to compensate for that loss of area in our environments. And also remember, and also keep in mind that there are economic considerations here. Expanding rice or maize area into new environments also requires substantial investments of infrastructure and improvements in market access, So it's not just about the expanding, but also all the investments that needs to be associated with that expansion in order to sustain a long-term cropping system in the new area where agriculture is expanding. So bottom line is that it is quite clear that intensification should be the way to go in order to produce more on the area that we have currently under crop production. And the whole goal of this presentation is to understand to which degree can intensification help Indonesia to meet its crop production goals on the existing cropland area. In other words, how much more paddy and jagung Indonesia can produce how much more paddy and jagung Indonesia can produce by intensifying crop production on the existing cropland area. As a starting point, I would like to show this conceptual framework that I'm gonna be taking as a reference during the rest of the presentation, which basically shows the different yield levels. On the left hand, you can see this yield potential, which is shown here with the green bar, which represents basically what's the maximum yield that is possible for a given piece of land as determined by the climate and the type of soil of that piece of land. So if the management is perfect and there are no limitation by nutrients or by insects, no incidence of diseases, then this yield potential represents the maximum productivity that the climate and the type of soil will allow. Now, we are not suggesting here that farmers should try to attempt this yield potential, because reaching this yield potential requires massive applications of nutrients as well as pesticides. So if a farmer tries to reach this yield potential, probably it's going to run out of business. So, but we know that from our experience working on agricultural systems across the world, that reaching 70 to 80% of the yield potential is a reasonable goal for farmers who have access to inputs, markets, and extension services, because at that yield level, the profit is maximized. Now, in most cases, what we find is that the average farm yield is below this attainable yield because of the insufficient supply of nutrients, because there is overall poor crop management, or there is incidence of biotic stresses such as insects, weeds, and diseases. So again, our exploitable yield gap represents the difference between what is attainable now with cost-effective agronomy versus what the farmer is harvesting now. And the size of this exploitable yield gap gives you an idea of how much more jagung or paddy can be produced on existing cropland by intensifying crop production with better agronomy. Along those lines, we have been working for more than 70 years on a project in which we are partnering with Wageningen University in the Netherlands in developing this atlas of yield gaps for major crop producing countries around the world. The idea is to try to estimate how much more food the world can produce on existing cropland. And in doing so, we are following a bottom-up approach in which we estimate these yield gaps following a global protocol that is applied consistently across countries and crops, and is based on a very strong agronomic foundation. And again, one of the strengths of this atlas is that because we follow this protocol in a consistent manner, then it will allow a comparison of yield gaps across crops and across different countries, or even perhaps what's more relevant for policymakers, across different regions within the same country. So that this atlas can serve as a basis for decision making as well as for setting priorities and informed policy. So on my presentation today, I'm going to focus on three major topics. One is on estimating the yield potential and yield gaps for rice and maize in Indonesia. The second goal is to explore future scenarios for rice and maize and rice self-sufficiency in Indonesia. And finally, I'm going to touch a little bit on recent efforts that we have made in trying to understand causes for the existing yield gaps. Again, I want to make sure that everybody understands that despite I am the presenter today, this is teamwork, this is a team effort. And this is just a slide showing our core team, which includes people from the University of Nebraska, as well as my dear colleagues at the Indonesian Agency for Agricultural Research and Development, Litbang. But you can also see there some faces from Bebe Padi, from the Indonesian Cereal Research Institute, and also from the Indonesian Soil Research Institute. But also these efforts greatly benefit from the contribution of our BPTP colleagues across more than 15 provinces, who were the ones who helped us to collect the data that we needed for estimating the yield gaps, and were the ones that at the end of the day help us to validate the results, and eventually the ones who that take over on the results and bring them back to the farm. I'm not going to go through all the methodological details on how we estimated these yield gaps, because that will take me another 30 minutes presentation, but at least I just want to give you a flavor on how we estimate the yield gap for paddy and for jagung in Indonesia. So everything started by identifying cropping systems for the major areas where paddy and jagung are grown in the archipelago. The next step was to use crop simulation models to estimate the yield potential. Again, I don't have enough time to spend here explaining how a crop model works, but in few words, they are mathematical equations that help us capture the influence of weather on crop yield, and therefore you can feed these models with long-term weather data, soil information, as well as the cropping system context, and these models will tell you what's the expected yield potential for a given region. Therefore, we use these models to estimate the yield potential across all the sites in Indonesia, and by comparison of that simulated yield potential against the average farm yield, we estimated the yield gap. So this is the process that we follow in estimating yield gaps for paddy and for jagung in Indonesia, and it's the same protocol that we follow for estimating yield gaps for other countries and crops as well. Paharis, everything goes well? Everybody can hear me?
It's good, okay. You can
continue. Great.
Yeah.
Good. This is a slide that shows 4 maps. Each of these maps shows the sites that we selected for irrigated rice, irrigated maize, lowland rainfed rice, and rainfed maize across Indonesia. As you can see, we try to cover the major areas where these 2 crops are grown across Indonesia, and that will include sites in North Sumatra, in West Sumatra, in Lampung, all across Java Island, West, East Nusa Tenggara, South, Central Sulawesi, as well as Gorontalo, and also there is a site there in South Kalimantan. And overall, our sites will represent about 75% of the area in Indonesia where rice and maize are produced nowadays. For each of these sites, and following the protocol that I explained before, we retrieve long-term daily weather data from BMKG stations. So excellent soil properties data from the available soil maps generated by the Indonesian Soil Research Institute. And our BPTP colleagues help us to really understand which were the dominant cropping systems at each location. And by the way, in overall, we have more than 150 cropping systems included in our assessment of yield gaps. From from the figure on the right hand, you can have an idea about the diversity in cropping systems that one could find across the different areas where rice and maize is produced in the country. From triple rice in Central Java, all the way to single maize in Eastern Tenggara. And again, here are some examples illustrating that diversity in cropping systems. So this is a picture of a woman doing some manual threshing in a double rice system that is irrigated in Manteng. Here you have a system with higher cropping intensity, in this case, irrigated triple rice near Maros, near Makassar in South Sulawesi. And this is a picture showing a system including three maize cycles per year in Jawa Tengah. For each of these cropping systems, we use crop models that we try to validate for the Indonesian context. And along those lines, our colleagues from BPPADI and from the Indonesian Cereal Research Institute at Makassar, especially Dr. Nurwulan Agustian at BPPADI and Dr. Syafruddin at the Indonesian Cereal Research Institute, help us to get the data needed to calibrate these models that we subsequently use to estimate yield gaps estimate the yield potential for paddy and jagun across the archipelago. And these are the results from our analysis. This is a map of Indonesia that shows stars. These stars represents the sites at which for which we estimate the yield potential, in this case for irrigated rice. And you can see there that there is some variation across the country, with the average yield potential for irrigated rice ranging all the way from 8 up to 10, 11 tons per hectare, per harvested hectare, okay? So if you want to understand what's the annual yield potential, you will need to multiply these values by the cropping intensity. So for example, in Jawa Barat, the average yield potential is around 8-9 tons per hectare. But if you want to understand what's the annual yield potential, you will need to multiply this by 2, which means that the average annual yield potential in this region is around 18 to 20 tons per hectare. But when we aggregate this to country level, the resulting estimate of national average yield potential for irrigated rice is around 9.5 tons per hectare, which, if you compare this value against the rata productivitas now of 6 tons per hectare, you can estimate an average yield gap of about 3.5 tons per hectare, which represents about 37% of the yield potential of Indonesia. In other words, on average, an Indonesian paddy grower is about 3.5 tons below the yield potential that we estimated for the country. Which again, that means that there is some room there for increasing productivity so that we can produce more on the existing paddy area now. This is the same kind of map, but in this case, the results are for lowland rainfed rice yield potential. And you can see that for lowland rainfed rice, the yield potential is a bit lower because of the water limitation. But perhaps more importantly, the yield gap is much larger for lowland rice compared with irrigated rice. There is a risk component associated with that. But bottom line is that on average, farmers producing lowland rainfed rice are about 50, their average yield represents about 50% of the yield potential, which means that in the case of lowland rainfed rice, there is even a larger yield gap compared with the gap for irrigated rice. In the case of maize, the yield gap is even larger. The yield potential that we estimate at national level is around 12 tons per hectare. The average yield is below 6, which means that farmers are reaching less than 50% of the current yield potential, which again represents a quite interesting opportunity for increasing maize total production by intensifying maize productivity on the existing jagun area. Okay, let's try now to understand how the yield gaps that we estimated for Indonesia compare with the yield gaps that we found for other countries. This is a figure that shows the average, the rata productividad for irrigated rice expressed as a percentage of the yield potential. In the case of China or US, farmers are kind of close to the attainable yield level, with the average yield gap representing about 27 to 33% of the yield potential. So in these systems, there is not that much more room to increase yield, simply because farmers have in practice reached what we call the attainable yield level. Now, this is on the right hand, you can see an example for sub-Saharan Africa. In that part of the world, average yield is very low, with the average yield gap representing about 60% of the yield potential for that region. In the case of Indonesia, the yield gap is on the upper side, in the sense that it's not that far from the one from the US, but there is still a larger room there for increasing productivity. And interestingly, the yield gap for Indonesia is smaller compared with the one that we estimated for some neighboring countries, such as the Philippines. So overall, Indonesia is doing quite well for irrigated rice, although there is still there some room for increasing the productivity. In the case of rain-fed maize, it's really where there are more room for increasing productivity. If we look at the US, the yield gap is very small, only 20%. Again, if we look at Africa, the yield gap is very large. In the case of South America, I'm showing there some examples for Argentina and for Brazil. You can see that the yield gap is intermediate from 41 to 44%. In the case of Indonesia, it's somewhere in between South America and Africa, with the yield gap representing about 50% of the yield potential. So again, we can take this from the bright side, that there is a very nice opportunity for Indonesia there for increasing jagun production by trying to increase the current yields on the existing cropland. Okay, so what do all these numbers mean for Indonesia in terms of increasing overall national production? So let's now make an imaginary exercise when we imagine that all farmers in Indonesia will reach about 80% of the yield potential in the case of irrigated crops, and 70% of the yield potential for rainfed crops. So let's imagine this is a scenario where there is a massive investment on agricultural research and development, so that all farmers in Indonesia will virtually reach the attainable yield level. If that's the case, Indonesia will be producing about 91 million tons of paddy on the current paddy area, which represents a 21 million tons increase compared with the current production level. In the case of maize, there is also a large margin there to increase production by closing the exploitable gaps. And you can see there that the potential production of jagun in Indonesia could be as high as 40 million tons per year. Again, if farmers will close the exploitable yield gap, so that the average yield represents 70% of the yield potential that we estimated for jagun. So again, these are estimates of what will be the attainable production on existing paddy and jagun area if farmers will close the existing exploitable yield gap, which will require a massive investment on agricultural research and development and appropriate policy, so that farmers can have access to those practices that would allow that level of yield gap closure. Okay, looking at the production potential increase is kind of give us half of the picture, because the next question is how these production increases will compare against the expected increase in demand in the future, right? Are these potential production increases via intensification enough to meet the the increase in paddy and jagun demand that we expect over the next 2-3 decades. So we try to answer that question by comparing what will be the level of self-sufficiency that Indonesia would achieve by closing the existing yield gaps, by comparing the potential production increase versus the demand that is expected by year 2035. As you can see from this slide, the demand for rice will increase around 20 million tons over the next 15 years, mostly driven by the population growth. In the case of maize, there will be also there a quite substantial increase, although in the particular case of jagun, that increase in the demand is not only because of population growth, but also because a change of diet, because of the inclusion of more products that has an animal and that are sourced from animals, like milk, like meat, like eggs, and therefore that kind of diet will imply a much higher caloric intake overall per capita. So we explored 3 scenarios here. One will be the business as usual, in which we basically project the historical yield and harvested area trends that occurred during the past 30 years into the future. A second scenario is where we look at what will happen if we continue with the business as usual scenario, but without further cropland area expansion. And then we explore a third scenario where we look at what will be the level of jagun and paddy self-sufficiency that Indonesia can reach by closing the exploitable yield gap for these 2 crops. This is a quite complex figure, but I will try to make it easy for you. This shows the production on the vertical axis and the harvest area on the horizontal axis. And this shows the historical trend from the 80s to the mid-20s. You can see that Indonesia average rice yield was around 4 tons per hectare in the late 80s, and Indonesia was growing rice in about 10 million hectares, which will deliver a total output of about 40 million tons per year. Nowadays, Indonesia is more close to 15 million hectares of rice, in a rata productivitas of 5 tons per hectare. Now, if we just project the historical trends into the future, you can see that Indonesia will be above the demand that is expected by year 2035. In other words, by just projecting the yield gains and the cropland area expansion trends from the past into the future, one can infer that Indonesia could be self-sufficient for paddy by year 2035. Now, that approach will require an extra 1.3 million hectares somewhere else beyond the existing cropland area, and that land requirement will be even higher if the productivity of the new land is lower than the current rice area, which is likely to be the case, as I explained in my first slides.
Patricia, your time is 2 minutes again.
All right.
Yeah.
I will try to speed up here.
Yeah. Okay.
And finally, in the second scenario, if we just continue with the historical yield gains, but we don't allow further expansion into new areas, you can see that Indonesia in that scenario won't be able to reach self-sufficiency for paddy by year 2035. In contrast, by closing the exploitable yield gap, Indonesia could easily be self-sufficient for rice without any requirement of expanding land, of expanding rice area beyond the existing cropland. Now, this is not that easy to achieve because it will require much higher rates of yield gain over the next 15 years, which has an associated investment on agricultural research and development. But at least it shows that from the perspective of intensification, there is a lot of room there to be exploited so that Indonesia could potentially reach a reasonable level of self-sufficiency for rice and also for jagun by year 2035, and at the same time reducing the need for extra land. And I'm going to spend the last minute describing a little bit recent efforts to understand some of these yield gaps. And I'm going to go directly into this figure, which shows that which are the candidate factors explaining yield gaps across 12 provinces in which we have conducted surveys across paddy and jagun farmers. Mm. And we have looked at different factors there, all the way from nutrients, weeds, pesticides, varieties, as well as incidents of other adversities such as rats and other things. And what we found is that across the 12 provinces, we have identified that nutrient deficiencies are strong candidates at explaining the current yield gaps for paddy and for jagun. And we have been making some on-the-ground work trying to diagnose some of these deficiencies. And we have found, for example, that in some cases, as it is shown in this slide, an example for South Sulawesi rice fields, we have found widespread potassium deficiencies across irrigated rice fields in South Sulawesi, which again points out at nutrients as a key element to be considered when talking about closing the exploitable yield gap in Indonesia. And I'm going to finalize this presentation by kind of going again through the major results very quickly. We found, I have good news for you, which are that there is room for increasing farmers' yields for both jagun and for rice. Now, the not so good news are that the current rates of yield gains are not sufficient to meet the demand in the future. So there is a need to accelerate current rates of yield gains, but our analysis clearly shows that intensification can help Indonesia to meet production goals and reduce the extra land requirements. And we are now working to establish the causes of yield gaps, working with our colleagues from Leadbank, and our preliminary results show that inadequate plant nutrition, especially potassium, seems to be a strong candidate at explaining those yield gaps. These results have been published in international peer-reviewed journals, and I also have the immense pleasure of hosting some of my Indonesian colleagues at the University of Nebraska, where we have a lot of fun. And having said that, I want to thank once more to the organizing committee for inviting me to present at this conference. And I think that now we can open up for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Patricia. It's very nice presentation. Please give applause for Pak Patricia. Maybe you cannot hear all the participants applause to us, but this is a very interesting, presentation. In front of us now, there are 420 participants in front of us heard about your presentation. And this is very important for our Indonesian situation. And for my opinion, Pak Patricio is also good. You can put on the situation, new normal situation now for analysis about the gap production in Indonesia, because the situation is very different now due to the pandemic COVID-19. Yeah, this is important also to capturing this situation for your next research, I think. Okay, thank you very much, Pak Patricio. And now we continue to the second keynote speaker is Professor Fahmudin Agus. He is from Indonesian Soil Research Institute, AARD, and he will presentation about the greenhouse gases emission reduction from Indonesian oil palm plantation, closing yield gap.
Excuse me, Pak Haris.
Yeah.
Pak Haris.
Yes.
Patricio would like to have the questions and answers first, because
okay.
it's a little late for him in the evening.
Okay, thank you, Pak. Okay, Pak Patricio, sorry. All the participants, if you want to deliver your question to the Pak Patricio, we give to your time. Is there any? Okay. First is Pak Sutomo from LIPI. You can deliver your question, please. And after that, from Rahma Yustika, you can also deliver your question. And the third one, you can also deliver your question from Pak Asep Kurnia. Time is yours, Pak Sutomo from LIPI.
Yes, thank you. A very interesting presentation from Patricio. We see that nowadays upland plantations are becoming more frequent in Indonesia, not just in Bali where I work, but also in Nusa Tenggara. So how this phenomenon would be impacting the upland hills, which we know act as a source of water and erosion prevention for the lowland areas. Thank you.
Okay, and the second one, Ibu Rahma Yustika, please deliver your question. Ibu Rahma Yustika, you hear me?
Thank you. Nice presentation, Dr. Patricio. My question is, what is the dominant parameter that determine yield gap in Jawa compared to in Sulawesi? Is it from cropping system or irrigation system or weather system? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Rahma. And the third one, Asep Kurnia. Pak Asep Kurnia, please deliver your question. Pak Asep, you hear me?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Haris, Bapak Haris. I have a short question to Dr. Patricio. What is the most effective way under your experience to overcome the gap? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe the last one, Pak Markus, Anda please deliver your question. Sorry for another, participant. We not have much time. We just limited to the for the participant to the question. Please, Pak Markus.
Yeah, thank you, Paris, for this opportunity. Patricio, I'm asking about how is about the environmental problems attributed by high rate of fertilizer and high input to close the yield gaps. Did you take into account when you make the calculation to close the gap yield, but have another negative impact of the environmental situation, especially when the farmers use the high rate of fertilizer? And also, is the cost is accepted from economical point of view? Although we are success say to close the gap yield, but the economic feasibility or the benefit obtained by the farmer is low. So I need your comment about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Markus. And now, Pak Patricio, time is yours to answer the question. Thank you, Pak Patricio.
Okay, thank you, Pak. Okay, thank you very much for all the excellent questions. I'm going to try to answer them one by one. And if I forget any of them, please remind me, but I will try not to. But as you can imagine, I have been working for 12 hours today, no dinner, so give me some credit.
Okay, I understand, sorry.
So, no, it's okay, it's my pleasure. So I'm gonna start with a question from my colleague from Bali about upland rice. And I'm gonna go back to this slide here, which shows what would be, how many hectares of rice you need, how many hectares of upland rice you need to attain the same productivity as 1 hectare of rice in Java? And the answer is 3.5. No?
Yeah.
You need 3.5 to get the same rice output as 1 hectare of rice in Java. And there are two reasons for that. One is that the rata productivitas of upland rice is about half of the one for irrigated rice. For irrigated rice in Java is around 6 tons per hectare. For upland rice is around 3. But then there is an issue of crop intensity there, because you can grow up to 3 crop cycles of irrigated rice if you have enough water from the reservoirs. But then in the case of upland rice, it depends on the in-season rainfall, and in most cases it can only be grown during the wet season. So there is here an issue of lower yield and lower crop intensity, which means that you need proportionally more land to compensate or to achieve the same productivity as 1 hectare of land of rice in Jawa Tengah or in Jawa Barat. But then there is also another dimension here, which is associated with the risk level. Upland rice depends upon the rainfall. So there is much more uncertainty for farmers about what's going to be the yield of the season ahead, because it will depend on how much rainfall is going to fall, and nobody can really predict that. And because of that climatic risk, farmers tend to be way more conservative on the management packages. They will be more reluctant to apply a fertilizer or to apply or to spend too much time on that field, given the uncertainty that there is there in relation with weather and in relation with the yield, and at the end of the day, in relation with the economic return to their activities on that piece of land. And therefore, one of the problems of growing upland rice is not only about the low productivity, but it's also about the high risk that is involved with upland rice production. And also associated with the upland environment, there are many constraints such as erosion, such as nutrient toxicities that are not that easily to overcome via conventional cost-effective agronomy. And all those things together makes quite difficult to think on a model for sustainable upland rice production. So, as you can see, I'm not saying that farmers should not grow upland rice, but I'm just a little bit skeptical about how promoting things like upland rice could help a whole country to meet its production goals. It may help, but it's not going to take you to the promised land for sure.
Yes.
All right. Now, in relation to the question about what explains the yield gap in Jawa, I think that's a question from Ibu Rama. And the answer is, I don't know yet. We have some ideas about what could be explaining the yield gap based on survey data that we collect across Jawa. At least our analysis, again, points out to nutrient deficiencies.
Yeah.
We believe that there are some nutrient limitations and some nutrient imbalances that may explain current yield gaps for rice. And one of the reasons why there may be this limitation and perhaps not that many people are aware of is because, as you can see from this slide, sorry, this one, there is usually a bad correlation between the nutrient availability from the soil and soil tests. This is an example for potassium that shows what's the potassium that was measured in crops that did not receive fertilizer versus the soil test in those same fields where these crops were grown. And you can see here there is a cloud of points. Basically, there is no correlation between the capacity of that soil of supply potassium to these rice crops in relation to the soil test. And the bottom line is that if you rely on soil tests to diagnose nutrient limitation, that may lead to a situation in which there may be nutrient limitations, but you may not be capturing those things with simple soil tests. And as I showed in my previous slide, we are finding that in many cases, potassium is deficient. But that doesn't happen too much with nitrogen and phosphorus. And the reason is that usually the subsidized fertilizer is a quite good source of nitrogen and phosphorus, but doesn't provide too much potassium.
Yeah.
And also consider that farmers will remove most of the rice residue. And basically when you take the residue out of the field, you're also exporting potassium out of the field that otherwise will stay on that field. Yeah. So basically you're exporting a lot of potassium out of the field, and you are inputting comparably lower potassium compared with nitrogen and with phosphorus. which overall creates an imbalance too. So I believe that Ibu Rama, I believe that there is a lot to do in Indonesia in relation with updating nutrient recommendations given current yield level, and through a much better understanding about soil nutrient cycling, and perhaps using other kind of techniques to diagnose deficiencies such as leaf color charts or maybe further analysis. Okay, as I expected, I forgot the other questions. So, Pat, do you think you can remind me about the other questions because they are not at the top of my mind now?
Yeah. You can see the fourth question, Pak Patricio, is enough?
Oh, hold on.
Yeah.
Let me see that. Okay, so the other question is on the, okay, I answered about the gaps. So 1, 2, 3 is our answer.
Yeah, 4.
Oh, this looks like a multiple choice. I feel like I am taking an exam.
Oh, okay.
So the other question is about environment. Yeah, that's an excellent question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pa Marcus, for the question. And if you remember at the very beginning of my presentation, I clearly say that it is not a good idea for a farmer to try to reach the yield potential, because that will involve a massive amount of nutrient fertilizer and pesticides to make sure that the crop grows without any limiting or yield reducing factor. So we usually say that reaching 70 to 80% of the overall yield potential is a reasonable attainable yield for farmers who wants to increase yield, but also wants to maximize the profit. Because we know that if you go above 70 to 80% of the yield potential, then you go into a high risk of environmental impact and also financial losses. So I agree with you that achieving maximum yields should not be the goal. The goal should be to reach a yield level that is around 70, 80% of the yield potential, a level at which a yield level at which farmers increase yields, but they also maximize the net profit.
Yeah. Okay, I think enough, Pak Patricio.
All right.
Yeah, another question will deliver by email or something like that for you. Yeah. Okay.
Excellent. And I can make available my presentation for the attendance to the conference if they. Okay. Thank you very much, Paris.
Okay, thank you very much again, Pak Patricio. On behalf of Badan Litbang, we very appreciate for your presentation, and we know the something very important is we must. This is our homework is we must updating our fertilizer recommendation based on your research or something. Yeah. This is very important for us because now still until now the major program in the Minister of Agriculture is potential production for sufficiency of rice in Indonesia. Okay, again, thank you very much, Pak Patricio, and all participants. Now we enter to the second presentation from Professor Fahmuddin Agus. He is from Indonesian Soil Research Institute. I think you all is very well know about the Professor Fahmuddin Agus, but in this occasion, allow me to deliver his curriculum vitae. Professor Fahmuddin Agus is a senior soil scientist at the Indonesian Center for Agricultural and Resources Research and Development, Minister of Agriculture. His bachelor student was earned from University Andalas Padang, and his master and PhD degrees were from North Carolina State University, US. His research focus on interrelationship between land use and land management and climate change. He also investigates carbon stock and greenhouse gases emission from peatland. He is a member of the Bureau of Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC, on the greenhouse gas inventory. This is our keynote speaker, the second keynote speaker. Now time is yours, Pak Fahmuddin.
Thank you very much, Paris. I would like to have the capacity to share the screen shortly, but I would like to also inform Paris that the project that was explained by Patricio was funded by KP4S, the project at Badan Litbang. So it's funded by KP4S and University of Nebraska. And what I'm going to explain is the continuation of the project. It's on oil palm plantation.
Okay.
So I would like to share my screen now. I hope everyone can see now the screen. So the topic of my talk is on the greenhouse gases emission reduction from Indonesian oil palm plantation, how to close the yield gap and how to control the expansion so that we can have a low carbon stock plan and have the synchrony of production and greenhouse gas production reduction. Just as an introduction, for those who are not familiar with oil palm, this is what the fresh fruit bunch look like at the top. The diameter of fresh fruit bunch range from about 25 to 45 centimeter. And it will be compressed and changed to oil. And the comparison of oil palm, the fresh fruit bunch to convert to oil is about 5 to 1. So 5 tons of FFB will yield 1 ton of crude palm oil. And this research is in collaboration with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, Indonesian Oil Palm Research Institute, Wageningen University and Research, as well as Balai Penelitian Tanah Indonesian Soil Research Institute. So the challenges in oil palm production is that it has CO2 emission from peat decomposition and peat fire. And it also has a high yield gap among smallholders. But the data will show that not only the smallholder yield gap is wide, but also from the large plantation. But we have the opportunity for future expansion on low carbon stock land. And it has started now that the later trend, the recent trend of oil palm expansion is into low carbon stock areas. And increasing the domestic and global market demands for sustainable, in brackets, the low emission palm oil. The EU markets, for instance, has specified the low carbon stock. And the way they they calculate the carbon stock from palm oil is using the life cycle analysis. But what I'm going to present this morning is only from land use change and from peat emission. And the government is also targeting for increasing production and also for reducing emission from all sectors, including agriculture, and agriculture, which has the very high rates of land use change, is oil palm plantation. And so it's very important to arrange in such a way how can we allocate land for the expansion of oil palm plantation. So this is the tree with the age of about 7 to 8 years, and it's this very green oil palm plantation. This is from one of the large plantation, and if you see the height of the tree is about 3 times the height of this Western man. So it's 6 meter, and it could reach 10 to 12 meters. And the taller it is, the longer the sickle for harvesting that you need. And you also see that before harvesting, you need to prune these leaves, and this is a good source of organic matter. So the facts about oil palm is that it's a perennial tree that bears fruit starting from the 3rd to the 25th years after transplanting. And it bears fruits all the year round. And there is a decrease a little bit when you have a dry season, but otherwise it's produced all the year round. And the harvest is weekly under the large plantation, and every 2 weeks for the smallholders plantation. And during the course of its growth, during its cycle, there is no soil tillage. So it means that the soil carbon is more conserved, and it requires relatively low labor. That's why it's very attractive to farmers. And it's very adapted to acid soils with pH of starting from 3.5 to 5. That also includes peatland and wetlands. And the main requirement is the high rainfall, but the majority of Indonesian area, maybe about 70 or at least 60% of Indonesian area has this kind of rainfall. And also the temperature, of course, usually it requires the elevation of 700 meters and lower respective to sea level. Oil palm now is employing about 8.2 million people, and the attractiveness is that the fresh fruit bunch is very easy to market at farm level. They just pile up near the farm, and the trucks will come and pay in cash. And it's a very competitive crop due to relatively low price because of the very high efficiency in the production. And wood palm oil occupy only about 10% of land of all worst oil crops. However, it produces around 35% of all vegetable oil production. So it means that its productivity is at least 3.5 higher than the average oil producing crops. Indonesian palm oil in 2017 produces 42 million tons, and Indonesia exports more than 30 million tons of palm oil, and with the foreign exchange of 23 billion US dollar. And half of the world's population uses palm oil in food. So if you see the biscuits, the cakes and so forth, very likely it contains palm oil. And palm oil is very versatile because it's very good for cooking oil, for food, and also for cosmetics, and lately for biofuels. This is the relative comparison of the productivity or the yield of oil palm compared with other oil producing crops. This coconut and jatropha are also tropical, but if you compare with other subtropical and soybean and maize, the yield of oil palm is far higher. The average yield in Indonesia is around 3.5 tons per hectare per year, but we have the potential to increase it to 5 tons, even more. This is the description of the expansion of oil palm area on peatland and on mineral soil in Indonesia. So this is based on the spatial data of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And oil palm is described as plantation in that map, but we make a correction of 0.9 of the all plantation. So the 0.9 is oil palm, and it matches very well with the data from the Directorate General of Plantation. So we have about 14.3 million hectares of oil palm plantation in 2018, and about 2.7 million hectares is on peatland. And it's, as you see, the area's expansion is very rapid. This is the pattern of oil palm expansion. This is the initial land cover, and this is the percentage of this land cover that change into oil palm plantation. So during the period of 2009 to 2015, the expansion is dominated by shrubland. So most of the land that is used for oil palm plantation is the shrubs. And as you see, the undisturbed forest is very minimal, and also disturbed forest is relatively small and also decreasing in the period of 2015 and 2018. There are expansion to other agriculture and so forth, and in the future, the expansion to other agricultural areas, I guess, need to also be controlled in order to protect the food security. So this is the description of land cover in 2018. I use the same source of the data from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. What you see here is this is a plantation. This is mineral and peatland, and oil palm only is about 90% of this area. But what we can also observe here is a large area of shrubland. Shrubland is the vegetation of a very degraded forest, with the carbon stock, according to our estimate, is about 30 tons or less. And this is very unproductive, and this is the subscriber of peat fire, and in the case, if it is on peatland, it's the source of CO2 emission. So the idea is, why don't we change the pattern of this land use change in the future only to use shrubland, but only shrubland on mineral soil, not in the peatland, because the presidential instruction number 5, 2019 says that we should terminate the new license to peatland in the future. This has been explained by Patricio earlier. So the potential yield, the potential productivity is something that hard to achieve. And based on the question from Marcus earlier, if we afford to achieve this, maybe some of the nutrients, some of the extra nutrients that we input may be lost due to leaching and erosion and so forth. So maybe the economical attainable yield is about 70% of this yield potential. However, the current yield level is far below the yield potential. So the idea is how can we increase the current yield so that it approach the yield potential. This is the description of the attainable, this is the yield gap relative to the attainable yield, and this is the current yield. So what it shows here, under large plantation, there is room for increasing about 38% of the yield to achieve the attainable yield level. And for the smallholder plantation, the figure is not far different. So we have larger gap for the attainable from the attainable yield. So there is a high challenge to increase yield under these smallholder plantation. The description for the mineral soil area, it's about 9.9 million hectares. This is the data around 2017, 2018. And the current FFB yield is about 18 tons per hectare per year. And again, if you convert it into oil, it means about 3.5 tons of CPO. And attainable yield is still far higher. So there are lots of rooms to increase the yield. And if we exploit this attainable yield, we can increase the yield of about 125 million tons without increasing the area. And that also translates to land saving of about 7 million hectares. So in our project, we, in collaboration with Awakening and Nebraska and IOPRI, we demonstrate the effectiveness of the best management practices on mineral soil under smallholders plantation. And we have a multi-institutional, multidisciplinary approach, including engagement of NGOs and also the local government. And the approach is we collect the farmers' agronomic and socio-economic data to identify yield and how to increase the yield. And field trial to demonstrate the positive impact of good agronomic practices on farmers' profit and crop productivity. And for the task assigned to Soil Research Institute is the analysis of carbon footprint. And we may, in the later year, include the nitrous oxides emission. And the research started last year, and it will continue until 2023. The research sites are 3 sites in Sumatra and 3 sites in Kalimantan. And I would like to say again that we put emphasis for this field test on mineral soil. However, the analysis of greenhouse gas analysis that I'm going to explain this morning includes peatland emission. So these are the control or the business as usual practices. And what we mean by best management practices to approach the attainable yield is how can we improve the harvesting system, for instance, by increasing the frequency from every 2 weeks to every 10 days or even every week. And how do we keep the land? How do we arrange the prune fronts and so forth? And how can we improve the fertilization, which means the balance and the rate of the fertilizers? And the test is effectively about 3.5 years. So the continuation of this practice is also very important. And we also develop 4 scenarios for the combination of yield increase and reduction of greenhouse gas emission. The first is the business as usual scenario, is following the rate of oil palm expansion, which is about 0.63 million hectares per year. This is based on the average expansion of 2009 to 2018. However, the expansion on peatland is kept only 25% of the historical rate, because this presidential instruction has been implemented, and we believe that it will be effective. But there will be leakage or not. However, we assume here that at least 75% of this presidential instruction is effective, so that the expansion, the leakage is about 25%, maybe for the smallholders and also the area in which the license has been issued. And the FFB yield is assumed to be constant at 18 tons per hectare per year. Under scenario 1, this is the alternative scenario, the FFB yield is equals the FFB yield under the BAU, and the expansion of 0.6 million hectare is only using the shrubland. Remember that we have about 20 million hectares of shrubland. And then the expansion is stopped in about 2025 because of land scarcity and the land status and so forth. And scenario 2 is the expansion scenario is similar to what we have in scenario 1. However, we increase the FFB yield about 0.45 tons per hectare per year starting in 2019, so that we can approach the attainable yield by 2045. Under scenario 3, the scenario is pretty much the same as scenario 2 in terms of yield increase and the area expansion. However, we change the level of water table in plantation on peatland from the current average of 70 centimeter below surface to 50 centimeter below surface. So this is the description of the scenario of FFB yield. As you see here, that the FFB yield is increased here under scenario 2 and scenario 3 of about 0.45 tons per hectare per year. This is not 45 tons, of course. And under the BAU and scenario 1, the FFB yield remains constant at 18 tons per hectare per year. So there is a potential to increase the yield of about more than 10 tons per hectare per year. And for the area scenario, we follow the trend of the BAU, and you see a little bit flip here because we reduce the expansion of the peatland area to only 25% of the business as usual. And for scenario 2, 3, and 5, we discontinued the expansion. We stopped the expansion in the year of 2029. And the result, if you combine this with the increase in the production, is not bad. And it probably a win-win solution for the production and the environment. So the method of the calculation, I will go very briefly. The basic Ipcc principle is the emission is the activity data times the emission factor, while the production is the area times the yield times 0.82, and the 82 is the correction factor for the young plantation that has not bear fruits. And the emission for land use change is the area undergoing the land use change times the difference in the carbon stock between the initial and used to that of the oil palm plantation times 3.66, which is the conversion of C to CO2. The emission from peat is the area of oil palm plantation on peat times the rate of emission on peatland. So the assumption, the rate of emission from peatland is under the BAU is 40 tons per hectare per year. And when we raise the water table of about 20 centimeter, we can reduce it to 25.4 tons per hectare per year. And the assumption of equal FFB yield on peatland and mineral soil is also applied here. And only emission from land use change, which is using the gain and loss principle of carbon in plant biomass and in C from peat decomposition are taken into account in this analysis. So we don't include the nitrous oxide, we don't include other sources of emission. So this is just a definition of time average carbon stock for oil palm. The carbon stock of oil palm started about near zero when it is transplanted, and it will reach 80 tons somewhere here, and so the time average, if we linearize it, is 40 tons per hectare. And so from oil palm to oil palm, it means there's no change in the time average carbon stock. But if you convert from forest with the carbon stock of about 180 tons to oil palm, so you have a net emission. So this is a better description. So these are the land cover with higher carbon stock. So if you change this to oil palm plantation, so this red line should be on the 40 tons. So you have net emission, but if you change this shrubland, bare land, and so forth to oil palm plantation, you have a net sequestration from the perspective of carbon stock in plant biomass. For the heterotrophic respiration, there is a relationship that I was extracting from WAKIT. This shows that for every centimeter of raising of the water table, there is a decrease of CO2 emission of about 0.3 tons per hectare per year. And there are many similar equations with higher slope than this one, but use these conservative figures in this analysis. So when you use when you decrease or when you raise the water table about 20 centimeter, you decrease the emission about 15 tons per hectare per year. So the result, this is the production. The production under the BAU, this is only attributable to increase in the area. So certainly we can increase the production of the FFB. And from one of unofficial publication, it says that the country is targeting the production of FFB of about 300 million tons by 2030, but it can easily be exceeded if the oil palm plantation is continued to be expanded. And under S1, when you don't increase the area and you don't increase also the productivity by you increase the area only up to 2029, and you can achieve this national target, but this may not be attractive enough. But under the scenario 2 and 3, the increase of the production is very significant. We can even increase the production to 500 million tons of FFB, which means about 100 million tons of CPO. If we, this is just increasing the yield to approach the attainable level, and we are only increasing the area up to 2029. Excuse me, I need to go back to the scenario. So the scenario 2, the area expansion is only until 2028. Yeah, so after that we stop. But the increase in the production is very satisfactory.
Apa model kita bisa 5 minutes again?
Okay, thank you. This is the CO2 emission. What you see here is that you can have, historically we can have negative emission from land use change from the biomass due to the conversion of the low carbon stockland into oil palm. So this compensates some of the emission from peatland. So, however, for the peatland, as long as the area is increasing, then the emission will be increasing. And this decrease here is due to the scenario 4, which is the increase of the water table of about 20 centimeter. This is in line with the BRG, the PRG, and also the Ministry of Forestry's regulation. If you look at historical land use change, this is based on a study in 2018. So in the previous period, the expansion of oil palm was dominated into areas with higher carbon stock. But as shown earlier, that in the recent decades, it's dominated into lower carbon stock area. That's why in the previous period, there is no such thing as negative emission from land use change. So this is all positive. Positive means bad here because it's net emission. But here we have we have negative emission. So this is the combination of FFP production and net CO2 emission. So the net CO2 emission is the lowest from scenario 1 and scenario, the highest scenario 1 and scenario 2, and the lowest for scenario 3. And the production is highest for scenario 2 and 3. BAU is pretty high, but perhaps the country cannot afford such expansion. And if we look at the emission intensity, which is the emission of CO2 per unit weight of CPO, again here the S3, scenario 3 is the best because of this is the contribution of raising water table, and S1 was the worst because the area doesn't increase that much and the productivity didn't increase. And S2 and BAU was pretty good, but BAU is less attainable compared to S2. So in conclusion, in the last decade, Indonesia has come to the reverse trend of land use change for oil palm plantation, from conversion of high carbon stock to lower carbon stock land. This is in part is due to the success of moratorium and followed by the termination of land use change into primary forest and peatland, according to the Impress number 5, 2019. The expansion to an emission from peatland is still a major issue in greenhouse gas emission reduction. So peatland is still the major source of emission. However, the sequestration from the land use change is still way below the emission from peat decomposition, and especially when we discontinue the land use change with the trend of low carbon stock land, and then the land use change doesn't contribute to lowering the emission. There's a high opportunity to increase FOB yield to approach the attainable level. The candidate for the management improvements include replanting of all trees with high quality certified seedlings, improve fertilization, including the rate and the balance of fertilizer, increase intensity of harvest, and improve management of the field. And increasing yield not only increase the national production, but also significantly decrease the intensity of carbon emission. And in other words, it makes palm oil a greener product. So that's my presentation, Paris. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Amrin Agun. Please for the Pak Amrin Agus. Very interesting presentation, Pak Mudi. You also talking about the gap analysis for, how to say, increasing the oil palm production and also decreasing the, how to say, gas emission, carbon gas emission. And now we continue to the last keynote speaker today in the plenary session. He is Professor Manny van Norwich from World Agroforestry Center, Nairobi, Kenya. He will presentation about the role of agroforestry in adaptation and mitigation to climate change. Please allow me to deliver the curriculum vitae of our keynote speaker. We call the Pak Manny, Professor Manny, was trained as an ecologist at the University of Utrecht and obtained PhD at Wageningen University, both in the Netherlands. Through his first job at the Institute for Soil Fertility Research, he got into plant-soil relation, and especially the role of root in model of soil functioning. He joined ICRAF, also now as World Agroforestry, in 1993, when it started the Southeast Asia Regional Program, and spent 24 years in various roles of the forefront of the alternative to slash and burn, and rewarding upland poor for the environmental services they profit program. After retirement, he still is a distinguished senior fellow at the ICRAF, while also emeritus professor of agroforestry at Wageningen. His many publications cover a wide range of scale, from minute detail around root to several aspects of global change research on social ecology system. Good morning, Pak Manny. Thank you very much for attending this international conference. And now time is yours. Thank you very much.
Ya, selamat pagi, Pak Haris.
Ya, selamat pagi, Pak Manny.
Whatever part of the world people are, I'm in Malang at the moment. So I think in this Zoominar, we started to zoom in on the details of rice.
Yeah.
And then we broadened a bit and we went to oil palm and we saw that it's not only fertilizer and rice, it is also becoming to water, and it comes in water. And what part of the landscape are we growing crops? But of course, agriculture is much more than rice, maize, and oil palm. And I think all the other commodities also need attention, as does many other functions of the landscape beyond producing food alone and getting income. So in my talk, I'll try to zoom out further and get to the wider range of everything that is included within agriculture and agroforestry. And I'd like to commit to start my presentation, because then we'll be sure we stick to time. Thank you.
Please, Pak Saiful, you can get to the...
In adaptation and mitigation to climate change. I'll be happy to share some concepts, some ideas, some evidence. And like any story in Java, we should start with the ground, the story of the tree of life, the harmony between people, all the animals, etc. And then it flips around and we have the demons and we have the trouble happening with us. That's the climate change story. And what can we do? Mitigate or adapt? Well, one view, and I would call that the non-agroforestry perspective, is currently quite popular under the name half-earth discussion, claiming, yes, let's keep half the earth for nature and all the animals and everything else, and that can mitigate for our climate change. And the other half is for people and the cities and all the farms that we need for that. And hey, in order to protect nature, we need a lot of money, and we can earn a lot of money from the carbon market with offsets that allow, on the other side, business as usual development to continue. So this is the non-agroforestry perspective. What do we have to offer as an alternative to that? Well, agroforestry started some 40 years ago, a little more than that, and it started against a non-agroforestry perspective in which we have agriculture here, forestry there, and a wall in between. It started with saying, hey, there are things that happen on the interface that are trees on farm, agroforestry technologies, and we can try to find out what these are at the plot and the farm level. Then after 10, 20 years, we realized that important things beyond that technology happen at the landscape scale, where there are interactions between the forest and the agriculture in the social sphere, interactions in the ecological sphere. And we need to look at that whole interface of agriculture and forestry as a social ecological system under change. Even that, what we call the second agroforestry concept, was not enough, and we realized that the problem is to some extent in the policy domain, where agriculture and forestry have separate policy spheres, separate ministries, separate mandates, separate technical training at university, and the only sensible way is to look at them together. So our agroforestry 3 concept is the sum total of agriculture and forestry and anything in between, because we don't want to draw lines, because we don't want to create boundaries. As a research topic, we started 1970s with a non-agroforestry separation. We moved into local technology, inventory of all the agroforestry forms. We went back to a more detailed research phase of understanding the processes. And then we gradually got more and more interested in the development side. And through that, we got more and more involved in the policy matters. So our multifunctional landscapes in which agriculture, forestry, agroforestry all coexist does play a role in many of the current world's problems, including the climate and the environmental policy domain. But even within that, we have seen separate measures for REDD for the forest from the discussion in agriculture that has been slower to start on the mitigation side. Well, the idea that agroforestry links adaptation and mitigation is not a particularly new one. We published about that some 15 years ago. We did a book on how trees and people can co-adapt to climate change. And we had empirical work in Vietnam and East African sites as well as in the adaptation is best understood as the reducing of risk, which means the reducing of three things: exposure, vulnerability, and hazards. Yeah. Now, risk occurs when all these three come together. So when there is a hazard, there is a storm, there is a flood, there is a landslide, whatever, and people are exposed to it. They are in the wrong place at the time that it happens, and they are vulnerable. So adaptation can mean reducing exposure. It can mean reducing vulnerability. Well, mitigation is mostly about the reducing of the hazards. And okay, transformative change can happen when both are addressed at the same time. Now in this talk, I'll touch on 7 different aspects of that. And the 7 aspects are different scales. So a number of them are at the scale of trees and how trees interact with soil and how agroforestry systems deal with that. Then we get a couple of points that are essentially at the landscape scale about floods and landslide risk, which lead to a concept of optimal tree density at the landscape scale. And then we go to maintaining landscape diversity, de-risking by options, an option portfolio, and finally the point that climate has an active role of vegetation in terms of the rainfall, recycling, and downwind effects. So scale itself is a very important concept in everything around agroforestry, at the same time in everything around adaptation. And we can see that scale coming back in the way we analyze. If we start with the system state, the state of land as we find it, we can move upstream towards the pressure. Why are people doing what they do? And behind the pressure are the drivers, the demography, the policy frame that constrains and that stimulates farmers to do certain things. Or we can go from system state downstream towards the impact. What is the impact of the land cover change that we see? And then move to responses. Now, responses in the dips here is sort of the end point, but it's more useful to see it as a loop. The responses can consist of, well, they can change. Adaptation is accepting that the system state is what it is, but reducing the negative impact. Mitigation is trying to shift the pressures and not affect the system state as much. Transformative change is dealing with the drivers, and the more holistic perspective is the reimaginative change. How can we shift the perspective of what does people need to be happy and healthy? Now, within that policy part, the loop, the responses part, we see 5 roles. There's the ABCDE, the agenda setting, a better understanding, coalitions, commitments, and devolved implementation and evaluation. And adaptation in the climate change debate came relatively late. For a long period of time, the debate was mitigation should do the job. We should control, prevent climate change from reaching dangerous levels. By now, we've seen that has not worked, and we have to adapt whether we like. In the development world, there is a lot of different words, and what we call it coping or resilience or adaptation, restoration, intensification, mitigation, transformation, sustainable development. And in the end, it's all about the same set of goals. It is all about removing all the different bottlenecks to development. And we can, if these 17 SDGs is too much to remember, we can go back to the triangle. It is about economic infrastructure, it is about social infrastructure, it is about ecological infrastructure. And when we make the list of what agroforestry can and cannot do, we see that it actually can be part of many different debates. It is about food, it is about energy, it is about water, it is about gender, it is about education, and also the ecological infrastructure, about the life on land, the life in water, and dealing with the climate change issue. A further concept that is relevant in this part is what we call the donut model. On one hand, we have planetary boundaries, make a list of all the things that can go wrong when we have too many people on the earth, and while we're on this side of the sheet. And we do that because of climate change, because of extracting too much water, because of polluting with nitrogen, with phosphorus, the ozone layer. So that's, at the same time, this side of the donut is that we haven't achieved that happy, healthy life for the majority of people on the earth yet. So we have deficits in terms of food, health, water, energy infrastructure, and the development space is there. Now, the optimistic perspective of this diagram is that there is a safe operating space for humanity, that it is possible to achieve reasonable standards of living for everybody without trespassing the planetary boundaries. And okay, climate adaptation is part of that attempt to get back to that safeness. Well, at the highest level, we can see that it is a simple matter of what is the size of the planet and what is its resilience. And on the other side, how many people do we have? How much well-being per person do we want? How much consumption is needed per unit well-being? How much production do we need in order to meet the consumption? And then how much area do we need to generate that production area, and what is left for nature after we meet all of that? Now, this level suggests that there are multiple intervention points. It is a question of what is that well-being that is desirable? What lifestyle choices do we have for quality of life? Reducing consumption and still achieving well-being? How can we reduce waste and have less production per unit consumption? And how can we reduce the negative impact on production on what we see? Yeah? So the Anthropocene equation at the highest level frames what adaptation can be like and what type of interventions in our land use, land cover system would help to bring us back to that operating space. Now, starting on the other side, we can see that we can start agroforestry at the scale of the tree, at the scale of the plot level. And then we see that, yes, planting a tree modifies the microclimate. People have done that around their houses, in their cropped fields, and benefit from the direct change of climate at the scale of where people live and where their crops grow. It can play a role in interacting with the soil, in increasing soil buffering, and adopting a multi-strata agroforestry perspective integrates that into a concept of agriculture examples. Within that, of course, the question always is which trees, what tree where, what is the right tree of place, and of course, agroforestry is not uniform. We have very different climatic zones. We have what we call a tree cover transition. We start with natural forest, it gets logged, it gets degraded, it can be modified to become an agroforest. Can get an open field agricultural situation, degraded lands, trees coming back in, and different parts of these trees we can call agroforestry and not. And at the same time, we have a topographic dimension between the mountain slopes to the coastal zone, and different types of agroforestry are relevant in different ecological niches along that topography. So we have to be very careful that we can't take one observation of agroforestry at one point and claim that it is good everywhere. Each of these things, each of these contexts needs its own analysis and its own problem. Now, in terms of water, of course, we get this concept of buffering. Both too much water and too little is problematic for people. At the same time, rainfall is unpredictable and erratic. So to what degree can the trees, and influenced by the soil, buffer that flow and avoid both the too much and the too little, while rainfall itself is uncertain. For some analysis we did, we compiled data from many different plots that vary from tree cover, from very high tree cover in closed forest to very low tree cover in land that is managed by forest authorities, either natural forest or plantation, in land that is managed by farmers, and in land that is in the suburban domain. And of course, there can be trees everywhere, but it can be different trees and they have different roles. In one paper published this year, we looked at data on the soil in terms of the above ground biomass. Well, that varies from almost 300 tons of C per hectare in the nature forest to only 1 in the degraded imperata lands and things in between. At the same time, we had litter layer data as well, as data is uncertain. Now, for some analysis we did, we compiled data from many different plots that vary from tree cover, from very high tree cover in closed forest to very low tree cover in land that is managed by forest authorities, either nature forest or plantation, in land that is managed by farmers, and in land that is in the suburban domain. And of course, there can be trees everywhere, but they can be different trees and they have different roles. All got included in the sample. So we have to be careful that the Ipcc carbon stock change for going from forest to agroforestry to agriculture can be underestimated what is really happening. Now, a second paper I'd like to call on is just published based on work on cocoa agroforestry in Sulawesi, where we see there is ecological structure, function, services, benefits, value. Well, we have the structure of the above ground and below ground vegetation that interacts with the carbon cycle and that interacts with the water cycle. At the level of services, we have the productivity, we have the terrestrial carbon storage, and we have the buffering erratic rainfall. And one of them is specifically relevant at the policy scale. The other two are mostly relevant at the farmer scale. And the question is there energy between that? For this analysis, the researcher, we looked at remaining forest, we looked at multi-strata agroforestry, 45 years old, 17, 10, 4-year-old cocoa is mixed with trees, and this is the land clear. And we found in the data that across that data, yes, higher soil carbon is positively related with more macroporosity, with a lower bulk density, with higher saturated hydraulic conductivity, and the available water capacity increases by about 50 millimeter. Well, that's about 14 days at 3 millimeter per day. So it is helpful in bridging dry periods during the rainy season, but it doesn't carry you across the whole dry season. In some further work, we looked at bringing in the roots into that story. This is a paper that should come out soon. And we get a closer look at how the choice of trees and the tree root system interacts with that matter of soil carbon and bulk density and the nutrition. And basically helps understand that, yes, the multi-strata agroforest is more buffered than the monoculture, the sun cocoa, but it is still very far from forest conditions. Well, that brings us to the next point. To what extent is that plot level interaction between the trees, the roots, the soil, and the water, does it lead back at landscape scale to managing a number of the risks, reducing the exposure, reducing the vulnerability of people? And within that, we have, first of all, the point of the flood and the flood risk and buffering. And then we see actually that in many of these issues around disasters, we can start with the symptoms, we can start with the land cover as it is, and we see, hey, there are floods, there are fires, there's drought, there is loss of soil, there is pollution of the lake, there is washed out bridges, there is no water in the tap, the hydropower doesn't function. Many things are symptoms, are problems of global climate change. But when you go to the branches of the tree, you can say, well, many of them come back to loss of hydroecological buffering. And that is the consequence of land use choices being made, and often is the source of conflicts. If you want to solve the problem at the roots, we need to know the roles, who is doing what are the drivers, what are the rules, and that's an analysis that often sees that these different symptoms come together in terms of what can be done and should be done about it. Now, some recent work in Rejoso in East Java, we looked at how much does it matter? How much canopy cover there is in terms of trees, going from almost closed canopy to nearly open? And we see that, yes, it matters for the part of rain that gets intercepted and evaporated from that, but the relation is different from the upstream, from the midstream zone, because of different canopies and different rainfall patterns. At the same time, we see that overland flow is a dramatic source of erosion in the undesols in the upper part. Whereas in the middle zone, we can have almost as much runoff as you want and still have very little erosion because the soil has a very low entrainment factor. So the people who say we need 30% forest in order to protect watershed functions, well, that's a random choice within something where it matters very much where you are, what trees they are and what soil. A further point towards the role of trees in adapting and reducing landslide risk is in the type of root system that we have. We just published a paper on summarizing this work on tree roots, anchoring and binding soil. And if you put it simple, separate the trees in the normal trees that look like every other tree, and there are trees that are in 4 ways are different. There are trees that have relatively few roots, where the ratio of root cross-sectional area and stem cross-sectional area is quite low. We have trees with a lot of roots relative to the stem. We have, on the other side, trees where most of the roots are horizontal, and we have trees where most of the roots are vertical. Now, clearly, in terms of landslide protection, we need 2 functions. We need the anchoring, we need the vegetation as a whole need to be pinned into the subsoil, so we need vertical roots. At the same time, we need horizontal roots to keep things together. So knowing what type of tree has what root system at what place can help us make a bit more informed choices of that. At the same time, the simplest rule is that diversity of trees is almost always a good thing to have. It almost always means that you'll have some trees with deep roots, some trees with shallow roots, and you'll be better off than choosing any single type of tree where they are. Understanding adaptation, a very important part is indeed understanding water. Understanding all the different things that can go wrong when buffered systems are replaced by unbuffered systems, and when water starts flowing through the landscape, rapidly causing floods when it rains, and not being enough buffered and not providing enough water in the dry season. So climate change adaptation brings us back in a big way to the whole debate about watershed management, which has been a strong drive to combine forest and agriculture, to have trees scattered in the landscape for these roles. At the same time, to see that it is not the total amount of trees that matters as much of where they are, and are they at strategic places protecting functions where it is most needed. And in that sense, the climate change adaptation debate should bring us back to all the ideas about integrated water. Within that, we can say, well, we can try to understand the water balance, what comes in terms of rainfall, what does vegetation and tree do in terms of interception, in terms of evapotranspiration, and how does it partition water between overland flow and base flow. So that's understanding at the process level. And with the more recent insight that it is not a flow but a cycle, that rainfall recycling over continents actually is an important part, and maybe even half the rain over continents is recycled. At the same time, we can look at it from a human lens of function. So what is we have here 9 watershed functions, the water transmission, the annual yield, the buffering, the infiltration, etc. We can try to understand what do trees do where in terms of supporting these functions, and would it make sense to say at the landscape scale that for climate adaptation we want to get more trees in order to reduce vulnerability and exposure? Well, that comes then to this point of de-risking by option, having multiple things happening. And we've seen, for example, in the COVID exposure, that farming systems with multiple options, farmers found something else to do when some of the markets collapsed and others were growing, whereas highly specialized farmers were into much more trouble. And that brings us to that last point of managing the rainfall recycling, which for an island archipelago like Indonesia is not as important as it is for Africa or Latin America. But there is increasing evidence that over the island of Borneo, rainfall recycling does play a significant role, mostly because the wind speeds are so low that moisture does stay over Kalimantan long enough to rain back. Which brings me to a final point, that classification that we have for climate change as either mitigation or adaptation is a bit like thinking that there are only two sides to a coin. And if you have a real coin, you'll see that it has a third side. Yeah. And so the way we looked at mitigation as reducing the greenhouse gas emissions so that the atmosphere would not change so fast and the climate systems would function, adaptation is dealing with the consequences of climate change. Well, in between, we see the third side of the coin is that tree cover and forest and agroforestry can have a direct effect on the climate system through, for example, rainfall recycling beyond moisture content, winds and temperature. And I think it's only gradually that we start to understand it. Unfortunately, the climate policy debate has focused on this mitigation and adaptation as two parts. So modifying rainfall by vegetation does not have a clear niche within the policy agenda as it has been framed, and it often comes in under the adaptation, but actually it is not just adaptation, it is actually modifying the climate as well. That debate I started off with, that half-earth part, and all the debates about agroforestry actually have, you can say, two dimensions. One is how much forest and tree cover do we have, do we want, do we need, and then how is it distributed? If you think of human needs in terms of urban areas, transport, industrial areas, open field agriculture, half open agroforestry, natural forest and its analogues, we can go on the left side and see very fine-grained mosaics, where the whole mosaic might be called agroforestry. We shift to the right and we get coarser and coarser patterns. We remove all the trees from the agricultural landscapes and we end up on the right-hand side with very strongly segregated land use planning, where we have the cities as cities and the agriculture as agriculture and the natural forest and the agroforestry for the half-open systems. So what is better, fine-grained or coarse? For what function and how? That is in a way the ultimate question. Now we can see that in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, the answer can be anything you want. For some functions, the closer sharing, the closer mosaic is more functional. For others, it is the segregation. We see the global deal for nature that wants a strong segregation. That's an extreme form of the land sparing. Have half for nature, and the other half people can do whatever they want. Now, we see the current debate on the experience with the coronavirus. We see two opposite trends. On one hand, we see that the lockdown has shown that the multifunctional integrated systems were more lockdown proof, where people had less negative impacts there. On the other hand, there's an argument from a hygienic perspective, to separate animals from people for the future, to avoid any next zoonosis to jump over to people. And the debate will continue. So which of those functions, how can we reconcile? More trees, more forest, less trees, more space for people, finer grained mosaic, great mosaic. And I think our debate on what is adaptation to climate change ultimately would come down to these large questions. At the same time, we have to build up the argument from knowing the trees, understanding the soil, and seeing how they interact. I look forward to discussing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Prof. Mene. Your time is very exactly 30 minutes. It's a good video, I think. Yeah, you start using wayang and you also put on the traditional music Java, I think. Yeah, it's very nice presentation. Now all the participants, we enter to the time for discussion because our time is a limit, and I just give for 6 person to the deliver of a question, and for the Fahmuddin is 3 participants, and Prof. Mene also 3 person. Now we start from Pak Fahmuddin. From Pak Lutfi Izhar, please you deliver your question.
Can we save some time, because I've extracted the questions and I have 3 questions to answer.
Yeah.
So we can save some time. So sorry, we don't need to repeat. So 3 main questions. One is very challenging. It's from Pak Imam Basuki and Pak Asep Kurnia. Can we reach the targeted production if we stop the current plantation on peat? I think it's a very good question. And until today, and probably until several years from now, I guess the plantation on peat will continue, and it also includes the plantation on for the smallholders. But we can impose termination of the future plantation. Of course, not at a certain time, but after the completion of the land rights. But if the land right is still there, they still have the right to continue the production. And remember, if they plant today, so it means that the crop will still produce until 2040 or 2045. So it means at 2045, if they don't have no more rights, and if the government, the government will no longer issue the new permit, then the emission from peat will gradually decrease and will reach 0. And at the time, we will have no more issues of the land use change emissions. Land use change and peat will be gone for oil palm. And we can reach the targeted production by just increasing the production, because there are lots of room for increasing the production. The second question is from Ibu Rima and Pak Isro. They ask, why not go to the 40 centimeter, Pak Isro is here on the screen, 40 centimeter below the water table. Well, Pak Isro is from Plantation. What do you feel? But the general feeling is that until 50 centimeter below surface is still okay. But we can still continue our research. What is the highest water table that can be reached at the level where the production, where the productivity is not decreasing? So if it is, if we can achieve 30 centimeters, that's great. So we have a better solution for greenhouse gas emission. There is a research by Pak Maman from University of Riau, but it's still based on survey to the government, not the agronomics analysis yet. I guess the Plantation, Pak Isro can conduct this kind of research, and also with us, the Research Institute. And the last question that I would like to address is from Pak Sutomo, maybe from the PPT, about the prospect of the use of remote sensing in the increasing in the monitoring of oil palm plantation. I think the prospect is very high, especially if we expand the definition of remote sensing to the use of drones. Drone can assist us in detecting the nutrient deficiency and also plant pest and disease, and with that we can manage the plantation in much better way. I think that's all, Pak Haris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Prof. Mahmudin. And the next question is for Pak Maine. Please show the question for Pak Maine. Your time now, Pak Maine, for respond the question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the first point is about, of course, there are many different trees that can be used. Timber for the long term, timber for the short term, fruit trees, trees with like rubber and other things that are manageable. And I think by and large, the comparison farmers make with the football team is an interesting one. You can't win the game with only attackers. You can't win the game with only a keeper. You need a team that has attackers, midfield, defenders, and a keeper. So diversity and diverse income profiles over time are, of course, the best way to reduce and manage risk. And unfortunately, timber has been researched by one type of people, fruit trees by a different type of people. And so agroforestry, we need to bring that together. And yes, there is a lot of detailed knowledge, but it needs to come together at the scale of farmer managed plots. Second point from Ari Nugraha.
Yeah.
Let me see. Yeah, there's many aspects here, and I think, and that is a point relative also to Pak Mahmudin's discussion, that of course the smallholder oil palm is start to become a dominant part of it. Yet historically, farmers have planted a lot of planting material that is not up to the standards, and the question is, what can you do? Experiments to actually improve management practices on existing oil palm give rather mixed results. But even when planting material is not standard, there is good palms and there's bad palms. So one way is to diversify within existing oil palm, take out the palms that are not so productive, and have grass for cows or grow other crops in between. In our analysis, cocoa actually is a very interesting companion crop under oil palm. So I think for every zone, there are specific opportunities that need to be considered. Quickly, the last point on rainfall and landslide. Yes, of course, landslide is unfortunately still very common in Indonesia and as well as in China, Philippines, and everywhere else. And yes, keeping trees with deep root system does help. It doesn't help for all the landslides. At some places you simply should not build your village below a slope that is susceptible. But from our analysis, it is indeed the diversity of trees, the trees that have deep roots, the trees that have shallow roots, that are jointly relevant and necessary to protect the soil. In a recent paper, we tried to summarize what we know about it so far. And I think it is a relatively simple observations about the tree root system can help you go beyond the generalizations. Not all trees are the same. Not all trees are equally relevant for these functions in different parts of the landscape. And I think the main point is that there's no single thing called agroforestry. There's a wide range of trees, a wide range of options, and decisions need to be made in the local context about it. Let me stop here.
Enough, Pak Mini? Okay.
I think so, unless there's
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation for Pak Mahmudin and Pak Maine. Please allow me to conclude our discussion today. I have 2 points. Maybe it is very useful for us. First is about the yield gap. We must be our focus in our program, our research in the future about the yield gap. We can determine our technology intervention based on the yield gap in the rice field or in the cereal field. We can update our fertilizer recommendation based on the current situation, because Patricia saw us about the the bigger factor influence to the yield gap is about the soil condition. And the second one from Pak Mahmudin about the oil palm, we should merit between high productivity and low carbon emission. We should merit about 2 factors, and we can determine about our technology, for example, water table, also for fertilizer. And the second one, from Pak Maine, I would like to conclude taking into account technology for adaptation and mitigation perspective to make sure our environmental of agriculture is still have sustainability to support our productivity and food. Thank you very much for the keynote speaker today. Again, on behalf of AARD, Badan Litbang Pertanian, we would like to appreciate for your time and your presentation. And also thank you very much. And also thank you very much for all the participants. We have very nice today to pass our knowledge in so of all the keynote speaker. Again, thank you very much, and I hand over to the master of ceremony. Thank you very much.
Thanks for sharing with us, Dr. Gracini, Professor Fahmuddin, and Professor Maine. And also thank you, Dr. Haris, for moderating the session. It's our privilege to have you all with us today, and we hope you will find the program we had lined up for you to be fruitful and engaging.